Today, we're going to cover some of the caving and cave diving disasters that we have covered on this channel. Be sure to subscribe for more videos like this. Florida sees its fair share of diving-related accidents. Ask any experienced local diver, and they'll tell you, more often than not, accidents happen to people without proper certification or who somehow don't prepare for their dive in all the ways they should. But frighteningly, this isn't always the case. Sometimes divers with years of experience and all the proper certifications die sudden and horrific deaths anyway, due to unforeseen circumstances that surprise them during the dive. Today's story is about such a case. We'll follow the tragic death of Zhou Min, a 28-year-old diver who drowned in Manatee Springs State Park in northern Florida. Despite having proper certification and diving alongside an experienced team, Min and her colleagues encountered what could only be described as a nightmare. It all started in November of 2019. Zhou Min, her husband Fu Xiaoyu, friend Chen Jian, and friend Wang Yuan all got on a plane and took what is typically one of the longest flights anywhere in the world, from their home country of China all the way to the U.S. state of Florida on the opposite side of the globe. They chose to embark on this extra long journey because all four shared a passion for cave diving and wanted to explore what some might call the mecca of the sport. Wang Yuan was a world underwater discovery instructor with more than 500 hours of diving experience. Compared to this, Min and the other two had considerably less experience. Min had about 2% of Yuan's experience, with just 11 hours logged at the time of their flight's departure. However, Min was technically certified and had received all the training necessary to legally explore Florida's caves. Not only was the group traveling to Florida in particular, but they also had a specific location they wanted to dive at: Manatee Springs State Park. The park is located in Chiefland, a small city about 130 miles northwest of Orlando. It attracts a wide range of outdoor enthusiasts, from swimmers to hikers to cyclists. But for divers, the boon is in the park's first magnitude spring. The term first magnitude means the spring discharges a particularly high amount of water every day. In the case of Manatee Spring, the daily flow can be as high as 150 million gallons. This is important to the story for reasons that will soon become apparent. On November 24th, Zhou Min, her husband, and two friends entered the park and strapped on their diving gear. Since the flow of Manatee Spring is so strong, divers basically cannot enter it head-on. Instead, there's a sinkhole upstream called Catfish Hotel where divers typically enter the water. From there, they swim upstream and explore much of the spring's internal wonders. Then, they exit from one of several points along the way. What divers do not typically do is turn around and exit back through the Manatee headspring. This involves moving downstream and riding the intense water flow the spring is famous for. Some divers, but not many, have done this successfully in the past, embracing the danger and enjoying the thrill of rocketing out of the opening like a bullet from a gun. One of them was Wang Yuan. Yuan had been to Manatee Springs on several different occasions, and he claimed to have ridden the flow out of the head spring no less than 3 times. This, combined with his generally high level of experience diving, made Yuan confident that he could guide the rest of the group through this rare and thrilling experience. But there was something Yuan didn't know. It had been a few years since Yuan's last visit. In that time, major changes had occurred to the opening of the headspring. Thanks to multiple collapses, the opening at the end of the spring's high-speed water flow was now much smaller, though still just wide enough for a diver to fit through. I'm sure I don't need to explain why a small opening at the end of a 150 million gallon a day water flow is dangerous for people who happen to be inside that water flow, especially if they don't know the opening is small. Ominously, this surprise waited for them at the very end of their exploration. Entering through Catfish Hotel, the four enjoyed an extensive and problem-free dive through the caverns and canals of Florida's world-famous underground before making their way toward the exit. At the front of the group, Wang Yuan led the way back out of the spring. He later reported that the flow in the spring was light when he tied off a reel to the main line. In order to reach the head spring, when traveling downstream, the group eventually reached an upward slope. Knowing the spring from past experience, Yuan would have recognized this spot as the beginning of the opening of the cave. He likely expected to encounter a palpable change in water flow upon arriving at this slope. Instead, Yuan was quite literally flung out of the cave. Thanks to the narrower opening, Yuan had unexpectedly been sucked through like a tapioca pearl through a straw. With his mask torn and his rebreather ripped from his mouth, he popped out all alone. He wasn't alone for long. Realizing his fellow divers back inside were in imminent danger of injuring themselves, he turned around and tried to force his way back through the opening. While doing this, he was nearly bowled over by Fu Zhaoyu, the second tapioca pearl in the straw. Now, both Yuan and Zhaoyu tried to claw their way back into Manatee Spring, facing torrential water flow head first. Hauntingly, both could see light signals coming from inside, which meant both their colleagues were calling for their help. Yuan could also see Chen Jian, but the force of the water flow was simply too strong to allow him to get inside and help his friend. Looking further, with difficulty, Yuan recognized that Qian was unconscious and had been wedged in the rocks. Yuan was also able to peer further and spot Zhao Min, who was also unconscious and caught in the rocks. However, unlike Qian, Min's regulator was not in her mouth, meaning every second counted in Yuan's attempt to rescue his friends. Summoning all the strength he had, Yuan forced his body through the opening of Manatee Spring. Hanging on to rocks along the walls, Yuan slowly and exhaustingly pulled his way toward the unconscious Chen Jian. He was eventually able to cut Jian loose. Even though Qian was still unconscious, the moment he came loose, his unconscious body went rocketing out of the opening of the spring, crashing into Fu Zhaoyu. Muscles straining, Wang Yuan then tried to force his way even further to reach the unconscious Zhou Min. Yet, despite knowing his friend was surely drowning at that very moment, there are physical limitations that are sometimes simply insurmountable. There was nothing Yuan could do. The current was just too strong. Faced with this, Yuan had no choice but to turn around and try and help Fu Zhaoyu revive the unconscious Chen Jian on the outside of the cave, leaving Fu Zhaoyu's wife inside. Fu Zhaoyu and Wang Yuan were able to revive Chen Jian. Sadly, the deceased body of Zhou Min would not be removed from the cave until the following day. It would take an extensive rescue mission carried out by a team from the International Underwater Cave Rescue and Recovery Organization. In order to first get to Zhou Min and then dislodge her from the rocks, rescue workers had to make multiple attempts just to get inside the cave. Then, they also had to move rocks, and they even had to remove her diving equipment in order to get her out. According to the National Speleological Society, it is considered normal protocol to check a planned exit before embarking on a traverse dive like this one. Yuan probably felt this wasn't necessary, given that he had done the dive several times before. But he didn't anticipate that the geology of the site could have changed so significantly in just a few years. This, of course, was a disastrous mistake. Even if the opening had been as spacious as the last time he visited, Yuan knew that he and the others were taking a risk. Rocketing out of an underwater cave is never going to be an entirely safe endeavor. And although less likely, such a disaster could have occurred even with the larger opening Yuan was familiar with. Following this horrible disaster that saw a 28-year-old woman killed and her husband and friends traumatized, Manatee Spring State Park decided to remove the main line from Catfish Hotel to Manatee Spring. They also put up a new warning sign telling divers not to attempt the flow-powered exit that Jo Min and her fellow divers attempted that fateful day. On this channel, we've covered some of the most harrowing tales from some of the most intimidating dive sites around the world. Some of you viewers may have wondered, which is the deadliest? Is there one diving location that's more dangerous, more terrifying, more unbelievable than all the rest? The answer is yes. There is one particular dive site with more fatalities to its name than any other. More astonishing than that, no one knows for sure exactly why. Over the years, this mysterious and lethal site has witnessed some very newsworthy accidents, including the deaths of famous divers. But while the international community may be familiar with some of these isolated, high-profile stories, the locals, especially the local rescue teams, are desperate to alert the public about the larger picture. This is the larger picture. This is the incredible history and enduring mystery of Egypt's Blue Hole. To visit the deadliest dive site in the world, you have to travel to a remote region of Egypt on the country's southeastern coast. Even today, there are still only a few major roads that will take you all the way out there, and only one small airport. Along the way, for hundreds of miles, you will see almost nothing but desert. In a country with more than 100 million people living in it, this entire 23,000 square mile region only has about 600,000 of them. If you choose to drive from Cairo, it'll take you about 6.5 hours, but if you do, eventually you'll reach the small coastal town of Dahab. Historically, the first people to arrive here were the Bedouins, Arabic-speaking nomadic people who have long lived in the deserts of the Middle East. With the dramatic Sinai Mountains perched behind them and the calm waters of the Red Sea at their feet, Dahab once served as an idyllic fishing village for generations of Bedouins. However, had these Bedouins been able to fly drones or board helicopters many generations ago, they would have almost immediately noticed something very unusual about their beloved fishing town. It has a hole in it. The jagged, rocky slopes of the Sinai Mountains descend partway below the surface of the Red Sea, but then jut back inward dramatically at one specific point in the coastline. It is at this particular point where, underneath the water, a massive depression sits in the flesh of the earth. Early Bedouins can certainly be forgiven for not knowing the full extent of what was hidden just beneath them. After all, the depression is an example of a strange geological phenomena that nobody fully recognized until at least the latter half of the 20th century. It is, in fact, a submarine sinkhole. It wasn't until recent decades that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration began working alongside recreational divers and fishermen who had been saying for years that they were finding huge underwater sinkholes in various parts of the world. Even today, the NOAA, or NOAA, is still unraveling the mystery of what the Blue Hole and other sinkholes like it actually are, or how they come to exist. Their current theory is that they are similar to sinkholes on land, but they're simply located underwater. The organization admits that much is still to be learned. It is still completely unknown how many of these submarine sinkholes exist, or where they may be located around the world. The full extent of the submarine sinkhole off the coast of Dahab wasn't widely known until the late 1960s. That's because in June of 1967, war broke out between Israel and the Arab countries of Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. The war was remarkably short, known to historians today as the Six-Day War. But in that short time, Israel managed to capture a swath of territory, including the Sinai Peninsula, and also uncover what many today consider the most beautiful and enchanting dive site on Earth. The Israeli occupation of the Sinai Peninsula would last for another 15 years. In 1982, the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty was officially implemented, and Egypt finally established diplomatic relations with Israel. During the 15-year military occupation, however, the submarine sinkhole off the coast of Dahab was explored by Israeli dive teams. Right away, for the first time, the world finally awakened to the extraordinary diving location that the Blue Hole of Dahab truly is. So what makes it so extraordinary? Well, for starters, unlike many dive sites, the Blue Hole is easily accessible right from the beach. You need only wade out a few meters into the water, and you're there, close enough to remain in earshot of the people still sunning on the shore. Knee-deep in calm water, take just one step forward, and it's a 400-plus foot drop. However, this is not the way divers actually do it. The proper way to enter is from the opposite side. The entrance to the Blue Hole is up the coastline, about 200 meters away. The next thing that makes the Blue Hole so unique is what you find once you enter. What looks initially like an unassuming drop-off into shallow water becomes, after just a few feet of swimming, an open void. It doesn't matter how clean or clear your diving goggles are, you cannot see the bottom. The beginning of the diving route takes you along what is best described as an underwater canyon. Huge rocky walls surround you on either side. Below, the walls descend deeper and deeper, eventually vanishing into the blue nothingness underneath. This wide avenue leads the way forward. The bottom remains so far below as to be completely out of sight the entire time. The height is actually so intense that it's common for divers to get vertigo. Floating in space, hundreds of feet above a perilous drop, the human body and mind have only one natural instinct in this situation. Yet, for those who can withstand the gut-wrenching environment, it can be the thrill of a lifetime. But the most astonishing part of this one-of-a-kind dive site is still to come. Eventually, as intrepid divers swim their way further and further, they see, growing in the distance, something that seems almost too mystical to be real. A bluish glow, as if there is a faint light source sitting at the bottom of the ocean. As you get closer, the bluish glow soon becomes undeniable. It grows larger and brighter until it dominates your field of vision. What this supernatural entity really turns out to be is a massive archway leading into the Blue Hole itself. From up at the surface, almost like the pupil of some massive eye looking out towards the sun, daylight pours down through the thin layer of seawater and floods down through the chasm of the Blue Hole. Recreational divers who have swum this far have already been flirting with the limit of what is considered a safe depth. Now, perhaps more than 100 feet below the surface, they must contend with the fact that this glowing archway is still way, way below them. Those who have seen the archway in person all share the belief that there is something almost magically alluring about it. Upon his visit to the site, the excellent diver and TV presenter Monty Halls noted that when you first come upon it, the archway looks easy to pass through, as if the open chamber of the Blue Hole is inches away on the other side. In reality, the archway is nearly 100 feet across. The blue light is so intense that it shines out across even that long distance, creating the illusion that it is much shorter than it really is. After descending to a depth of over 400 feet and passing through this incredible archway, divers rise through the glowing vertical tunnel and emerge back into daylight at the main opening of the Blue Hole. The entire dive, from start to finish, carries you a mere 250 meters along the shoreline. Now, while undeniably one of the most uniquely beautiful sights in the world, it is also unusually simple and straightforward. In fact, some in the technical diving community have made the claim that the Blue Hole should be one of the safest dive sites in the world. But it isn't. The rocky outcroppings near the entrance are littered with signs. Little makeshift tombstones with name after name after name after name. In fact, the total death count is unconfirmed, but ask a local Bedouin diver named Tariq Omar, who has been conducting body recoveries at the Blue Hole for decades, and he'll tell you that well over 100 people have died in the Blue Hole. Some divers familiar with the area even estimate as many as 200. This means the Blue Hole is by far the most lethal diving site on Earth. No cursed Mexican cenote nor dizzying Florida sinkhole even comes close to the rate of death that this wide, straight 250-meter stretch of Egyptian coastline somehow has. In fact, based on records kept by the International Underwater Cave Rescue and Recovery, the entire state of Florida, arguably the mecca of extreme underwater diving sites, has roughly the same yearly death toll as the Blue Hole on its own. Imagine one small stretch of highway out in the middle of nowhere causing as many accidents as every Formula One racetrack combined. Or imagine one small town restaurant where more people get sick than every restaurant in a nearby city combined. Clearly, something out of the ordinary has to be going on. There is something freakish beneath the surface of the Blue Hole of Dahab, and it's killing divers of all skill levels at a rate that is beyond abnormal. So, what is it? The people of Dahab have a local legend to explain the sensational killing capacity of the site. The legend states that long ago, there was a young woman who lived on the coast of Dahab named Shaheen. Shaheen had fallen in love with a local boy, but their love was forbidden by their parents. Against her will, Shaheen was engaged to be married to another man, a man who she didn't love. Way back then, the opening to the Blue Hole was not yet submerged by the sea. In despair, the young Shaheen threw herself over the edge, falling to her death. According to local legend, the Blue Hole is now haunted by Shaheen's restless spirit. With the enticing glow of the archway hundreds of feet below, the broken-hearted Shaheen lures young men to her, hypnotizing them before taking their souls into the next world. It's a stirring fable, and perhaps one that has more than a hint of truth behind it. But surely there has to be more to it than that. Well, as we're about to see, the history of deaths at this site is nothing short of unbelievable. So, without further ado, let's take a closer look at some of the people who have met their doom in the Blue Hole. Perhaps their stories can help shed some light on the true nature of this mind-bending phenomena. In November of 1997, two experienced divers from Ireland were in Dahab diving with the Paddy Diving School. They were 22-year-old Martin Guerra and 23-year-old Conor O'Regan. According to a report by the Irish Times, O'Regan had previous experience not only diving, but specifically with diving in the Red Sea. His fellow diver Guerra was a diving instructor who had been living in Egypt for the past year. On Wednesday, November 19, 1997, local diver Tarek Omar got the call he had been fearing he would get ever since he started working as an instructor in the area 2 years prior. Martin Guerra and Conor O'Regan had entered the Blue Hole together and had failed to resurface. Steeling his resolve, Omar dove into the Blue Hole to look for the missing pair. What he ended up finding would leave a permanent mark on his memory. The two Irishmen were resting in a ditch about 335 feet below the surface. Both had drowned, and yet their bodies remained locked in a haunting embrace, almost two corpses dancing. Omar later speculated that one had been sinking and the other had been trying to pull them back up when the pair both eventually drowned. But which of the pair had first begun sinking, and why? Their names are among the many that line the rock wall near the entrance, ensuring that even today, their tragic deaths will at the very least be remembered. But understood or explained? Not so much. Nearly a decade earlier, before Tarek Omar had moved to Dahab and earned himself the nickname Bone Collector, another pair of divers had met a similar fate. Daniel Malak and Tarek El-Khadi both drowned in the Blue Hole on the same day in 1988. Tarek Omar had very little time to dwell on the past, however. Within a couple of years of his first grisly recovery mission, he found himself at the forefront of what would become the Blue Hole's most famous death. In April of the year 2000, 22-year-old Russian-Israeli diving instructor Yuri Lipsky had been itching to dive the blue hole for at least a year prior. On that fateful day, witnesses say they saw Lipsky entering the water off the coast of Dahab with two very important things missing: a diving buddy and an extra oxygen tank. Lipsky's motivations for diving alone and with only one oxygen tank remain controversial to this day. But amazingly, one thing we do know he had with him that day was a video camera. The last anybody saw him alive, Lipsky was walking up the coast in his diving gear. When he failed to resurface, word spread quickly. Within a day, Lipsky's father had traveled from Russia to Dahab to look for his son. The man was reportedly all but ready to dive into the hole himself and had to be talked out of it by locals. Once again, the task of searching the blue hole fell to Tarek Omar. The search for Yuri Lipsky was unusual, in that Lipsky had been diving alone, and no one knew how far into the hole he had actually made it. The only way to find out was to conduct a thorough search. Lipsky's body was eventually found at 115 meters below the surface, nearly 3 times the depth considered safe for recreational divers. But Lipsky was no amateur. The 22-year-old was in fact a diving instructor. So why, millions soon wondered, did the video captured by his camera show him descending at a rapid rate towards his own demise? The roughly 7-minute video went on to make Lipsky's death one of the most famous in diving history. It was as disturbing as it was mysterious. Tarek Omar would later offer the theory that Lipsky was weighed down and that his camera may have tipped the scales. However, this explanation alone hasn't been enough to stop the internet from proliferating various theories about the nature of this strange and horrifying accident. Overlooked amid much of the hysteria is the fact that Lipsky's death is part of a larger phenomena, and the phenomena did not stop with Lipsky. A few years after Yuri Lipsky's death received international attention, a 24-year-old diver from England named James Smith went missing at the Blue Hole. The story initially followed what seemed to be emerging as a pattern. He entered the water, and somewhere between there and the opening 250 meters away, he simply vanished. However, one thing that makes Smith's death particularly haunting is that despite the fact he was known to die in a very specific location, namely the Blue Hole, his body has never been found. The rest of us can only assume he's still buried somewhere deep beneath the surface of the Red Sea, swallowed forever by the alluring spirit of Shaheen. Visitors to the Blue Hole today will see James Smith's name alongside many others. But there's another name that might make you do a double take. Karl Marx. It's not the author of the Communist Manifesto. It is, in fact, a 45-year-old German diver who had a fatal accident on January 10, 2007 at the Blue Hole of Dahab. A year after Marx, Swiss diver Stefan Felder suffered a similar fate, descending confidently and peacefully into the calm coastal waters of the Red Sea. Then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, he was nowhere to be found. In recent years, the deaths have not shown any signs of stopping either. In fact, in 2017, international interest was reignited in the remote diving site after a dramatic incident involving multiple pro divers. World record-setting freediver Alicia Zecchini traveled to the Blue Hole in July of 2017. Not only was Zecchini planning to dive at the deadly site, but she would in fact be attempting something that perhaps no person had ever attempted before. She would be trying to cross the Blue Hole's famous archway with just a single breath. Accompanying Zecchini was Irish safety diver Stephen Keenan. Keenan was described by Outsider magazine as, quote, "freediving's most accomplished and beloved safety diver." Surely, if anyone could pass through the deadly Blue Hole and live to tell the tale, it would be the sport's most accomplished and beloved safety diver, right? At about 160 feet below the surface, Alicia Zecchini became disoriented. Automatically, Keenan dove down to meet her. As he swam towards the surface carrying Zucchini, Zucchini was eventually able to regain her bearings and swim to safety. But when she got there, Keenan was nowhere to be found. It was later determined that Keenan had blacked out. It is unknown to this day the depth at which Keenan lost consciousness. He was found floating on the surface nearby, face down, motionless. Keenan's death sent shockwaves through the international diving community, providing even more evidence that the forces at work in Dahab were truly something above and beyond the ordinary in an already extraordinary sport. Alright, we've now looked at just 9 of the potentially 200-plus fatal accidents that have occurred at the Blue Hole. Frankly, most of what we learn from these stories is that whatever forces are at work, they're swift and they're powerful. Divers seem to just disappear in the blink of an eye. Seasoned professionals seem to suddenly lose their grasp of the situation, descending inexplicably, almost as if they're doing it on purpose. As bizarre as the whole thing is, thanks to an international community of diving experts and a growing interest in the site over previous decades, some plausible explanations do exist. We'll go through these one by one, starting with the phenomena known as narcosis. In underwater diving, one of the most important factors for divers to always consider is the inherent risk of breathing out of a gas tank at extreme depth. According to the NIH, quote, "Certain gases at high pressure cause an anesthetic effect that alters a diver's consciousness." This strange condition has also been nicknamed the raptures of the deep. It has even been called the martini effect for the drunken state it seems to put unsuspecting divers in. The mechanics of it are still not completely understood by science, but in short, certain gases with higher lipophilicity cause mental impairment as underwater depth increases. These effects can be felt starting at depths below around 30 feet, and they're usually mild. But once you start descending to extreme depths of several hundred feet or more, the symptoms are downright shocking. Divers breathing at a depth of below 300 feet can experience powerful hallucinations. They can also lose their sense of both time and direction while experiencing dramatic changes in mood, including becoming manic or euphoric. In extreme cases, narcosis itself can even kill you. Divers in the Blue Hole are potentially encountering depths of 400 feet below the surface, meaning they are way beyond even the far threshold for severe narcosis. The connection here between the science and the mythology is hard to ignore. Upon reaching the glowing blue archway, divers may suddenly be overcome by an eerie change in both body and mind. This change is, by all accounts, something like being really drunk, really confused, and suddenly enthusiastic and impulsive. Could this be the sinister lore of the ancient spirit of Shaheen? As chilling as it is to consider, it is quite possible that many of the divers who met their demise here met it by the propulsion of their own flippers. Just ask Sylvie Martin. An experienced diver in her own right, Martin was diving the Blue Hole when, according to her own first-hand account, she began feeling off. At about 200 feet below the surface, she actually began intentionally deflating her buoyancy regulator. Her dive buddy had to swim down, grab her, and pull her up toward the surface before she suddenly came to her senses again. If narcosis can induce borderline suicidal behavior in experienced divers, what can it do to inexperienced divers? The simple reality of the Blue Hole is that it is really, really deep, much deeper than many diving enthusiasts will ever go in their lifetime. Depth does incredibly dangerous things to your mind. But that's not all that depth does. Another deadly obstacle imposed by the Blue Hole's extreme depth is the sheer challenge of breathing itself. Not only do you run the risk of crazy hallucinations and deranged behavior thanks to narcosis, but you also run the risk of simply running out of air. The reason for this is simple, but easy to overlook or underestimate. The further you descend underwater, and the more water pressure increases, the more oxygen you need. This need increases at an alarmingly fast rate. Atmospheric pressure doubles every 10 meters. So, roughly speaking, every 10 meters you descend, your body requires double the amount of oxygen. When you are hundreds of feet below the surface, the amount of air you need to breathe is many, many times more than what you would normally need on land. Bringing enough air to make it all the way through the depths of the blue hole is a genuine logistical challenge. Even if you bring all the necessary equipment with you, which will surely include several tanks with different gas mixes which you can easily cycle through, you can't hang out down there for long. On the other hand, if you don't bring enough air in the first place, you're obviously in big trouble from the moment you start the dive. To be so catastrophically underprepared would seem like a rookie mistake, but there is ample reason to think that even experienced divers can seriously miscalculate at this particular site. For example, Yuri Lipsky, a diving instructor, reportedly entered the blue hole with only one tank strapped to his back. Even those who are familiar with the fact you need more oxygen for lower depths can still underestimate just how much they need for depths as extreme as this. So in short, we can add unexpectedly running out of air to the list of possible explanations, in addition to losing your mental faculties due to narcosis. But there's still more going on here. It's hard enough already to navigate an underwater dive site with a narcosis-drunken brain and no air in your lungs. But try doing it while also being so deep underwater that you can't even figure out which direction is the surface and which direction is the bottom of the ocean. Now, this sounds almost impossible because it's so far removed from our intuitions about the physical world, but in such a foreign, extreme environment, basic senses we normally rely on start to break down. According to the National Ocean Service, it is rare that sunlight ever reaches further than 200 meters below the surface of the ocean. Divers in the blue hole are potentially swimming well over halfway toward the point where their surroundings would become as black as empty outer space, where photosynthesis is impossible, and where, soon enough, David Attenborough would start pointing out shrimp that glow in the dark and fish with light bulbs dangling in front of their faces. Divers in the blue hole never quite reach this point of total blackness, but keep in mind, they are also wearing masks and heavy diving equipment. And they are swimming through dramatic underwater landscapes that block out what little light there is even further. The ominously intriguing blue glow of the archway is made so, in large part, by the fact that it dominates the spectrum of visible light at that depth. Now, divers will inevitably carry flashlights, but while these are lifesavers when it comes to one's immediate surroundings, they don't provide much help when it comes to the larger picture. Floating through deep, open waters with little to no ability to see the surface means you might decide it's time to bail, and yet realize with shock that you don't know which way to go. This, too, might explain why so many divers who enter the blue hole fail to resurface. There is one last factor worth considering when it comes to the blue hole, or rather, the Red Sea in general. The Red Sea is a unique body of water for two reasons. One, it is home to an unusually vast array of marine life, both fish and plant, many of which can only be found there and nowhere else. And two, it is largely unexplored. Couple this with the fact that many of the blue hole's victims, including even some of the ones we looked at today, have never been found, and it does paint an interesting picture. Of course, let's be clear, this is highly speculative, but it does seem possible, given the amount of unique marine life and how little we still know about what lies beneath the Red Sea, that chance encounters with hostile organisms could perhaps explain some of these disappearances too. After all, where else are unsuspecting divers plunging freely into extreme depths of this particular body of water on a regular basis? The Red Sea has plenty of other popular diving sites, but none so extreme, so deep, so full of shadows. There is something distinctly human about underwater diving. It represents one of our most innate traits in its purest form, the primal impulse to venture into the unknown. It is hard to imagine a world more alien than the world awaiting those who swim the blue hole of Dahab, and yet it sits freely accessible just meters away from the bars and beach towels that line the South Egyptian shore. But this alien world also inflicts strange, rapid infirmities upon our land-dwelling human bodies. It sucks the air from our lungs, even when we thought we brought enough air with us. It confounds our special awareness, temporarily erasing physical realities as fundamental as the sky above and the ground below. Perhaps most frightening of all, it corrupts our minds, making us think and do things that only moments ago we would have never imagined. Contrary to what many might believe, however, safely diving the blue hole of Dahab is, in fact, possible. Highly experienced, technically proficient divers can and do take all the necessary precautions and swim through this marvelous natural wonder on a regular basis. But sadly, even to this day, they constitute a mere percentage of the total number of divers who make the voyage out to this mystical and remote site. Until the international diving community wakes up to the truly incredible risks associated with the blue hole and begins heeding the warnings and advice of local experts like Tarek Omar, the blue hole of Dahab will continue to cast its alluring spell over unsuspecting divers, reeling them in with its magical glow, then snatching them out of existence before anyone has time to save them. We hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Tell us, what do you think is the most likely explanation for the huge amounts of deaths at the blue hole of Dahab? Would you ever consider visiting the site yourself? Please share your thoughts with us in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and please be sure to like the video and subscribe for more content like this in the near future. That's all for now. We'll see you next time. John Jones found himself trapped in the notoriously narrow Nutty Putty Cave in Utah while he was exploring. He became wedged upside down in a passage barely wider than a dryer door. Due to the position he was in, blood started accumulating in his brain, putting his life in jeopardy unless he was rescued promptly. This recounts the tale of John Jones and the tragic incident at Nutty Putty Cave. John Edward Jones came from a large family with 7 siblings. When he was a kid, he and his brother Josh were introduced to cave exploring by their dad. They enjoyed going on cave trips all over Utah during their childhood. At 26, John was married with a 1-year-old daughter and another baby on the way. They lived in Virginia, where John was studying to be a children's heart doctor. One Thanksgiving, John went back to Utah to spend time with his family. They all decided it would be fun to explore Nutty Putty Cave together and enjoy the holiday. On the evening of November 24th, 2009, around 8 gals p.m., John and a group of 10 friends and family members squeezed their way through the narrow entrance of Nutty Putty Cave. First explored in 1960 by caver Dale Green, Nutty Putty. Cave is situated 55 miles, 88.5 kilometers south of Salt Lake City, Utah. At its prime, Nutty Putty drew in 25,000 visitors annually, renowned for its tight, slippery tunnels and challenging squeezes. Formed by hydrothermal vents carving through limestone, Nutty Putty Cave derives its name from the putty-like brown clay lining its walls. Hydrothermal caves like Nutty Putty are marked by a series of expansive domes interconnected by narrow, twisting passages. The various sections of Nutty Putty bear names suited to their size, such as the birth canal, the aorta, the maze, and the scout eater. Overall, Nutty Putty spans 355 feet, 413 meters in length, and descends 145 feet, 44 m underground. Nutty Putty Cave has also seen its share of challenges. Due to its popularity, excessive smoothing of the limestone rocks occurred, leading to predictions of fatalities in certain sections. Indeed, in 2004, 5 years prior to John Jones's expedition, 2 Boy Scouts narrowly escaped death in separate incidents within a week of each other. In one instance, it took rescue crews 14 hours to extricate a 16-year-old scout from the cave using a complex system of pulleys. In the aftermath of these incidents, the cave was closed to visitors and remained shut until May 2009. A gate was installed at the entrance, and visitors had to make reservations in advance to ensure only one group entered the cave at a time. Upon entering the cave, the group ventured into the largest chamber known as the Big Slide. Subsequently, John, his brother Josh, and two friends set out to explore a more challenging section they had heard of, called the Birth Canal. This narrow passage drops down and opens into a larger chamber, resembling a birth process as one emerges from it. John discovered a hole in the wall that he believed led to the birth canal and entered headfirst. Crawling on his stomach, he searched for any further openings but found the tunnel narrowing as he progressed. The exact location within the cave where John was at this point remains unclear. Some sources suggest he had entered the birth canal correctly but inadvertently veered into another section known as Scout Eater, while others claim he was in a nearby tunnel named Ed's Push. Regardless, these tunnels do not lead to any sufficiently large spaces and remain unexplored. Eventually, John encountered a sharp downward turn in the tunnel, almost vertical in descent. Possibly thinking he had found the descent he sought in the birth canal, John carefully maneuvered down the cramped tunnel, measuring only 10 inches by 18 inches across. Soon, he realized his grave error. The tunnel didn't widen, but instead grew narrower, trapping him upside down. His brother Josh was the first to reach him. Despite Josh's efforts to pull him out, John slipped back into the crevice, further wedging himself with one hand pinned underneath and the other forced backward. Only his feet and ankles protruded from the crevice. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, John and Josh offered a quick prayer before Josh rushed out of the cave for help. The first rescuer on the scene was Susie Motola. By the time she reached John at 12:30 a.m., he had been trapped for 3 hours, 400 feet, 122 meters into the cave, and 100 feet, 30.5 meter underground. Introducing herself to John's visible black running shoes, Susie received John's anxious plea. "Hi, Susie, thanks for coming, but I really want to get out of here." Over the ensuing hours, numerous rescuers arrived, brainstorming various strategies to free John. They even considered lubricating the cave walls to facilitate his extraction. Eventually, they settled on a plan involving climbing cams and ropes. However, progress was hindered by the narrow passages and the need to widen the tunnel. The drilling process was painstakingly slow, inching forward due to the compact space. Moreover, John's awkward positioning further complicated matters. The ceiling's low height above John's location prevented a straightforward extraction. Rescuers had to lift him in increments, constantly readjusting their approach. The initial attempt with climbing cams proved futile, leading them to opt for feeding the rope through pulleys attached to the cave walls. Despite the efforts of nearly 100 rescuers, progress remained sluggish, with only one person able to access John at a time. As the rescue stretched on for 19 hours, John's condition deteriorated. Being upside down caused blood to pool in John's brain, straining his heart's efforts to circulate blood. This physiological challenge, compounded by the prolonged ordeal, posed a fatal risk. John began experiencing breathing difficulties and oscillated between calmness and panic. Around this time, a two-way radio was lowered into the cave, allowing John and his wife to communicate amidst the harrowing circumstances. Despite their mutual concerns, John and his wife endeavored to offer solace to each other. Finally, the rescuers completed drilling the necessary holes and affixed the pulleys to the cave walls. 8 men grasped one end of the rope and commenced the arduous task of pulling John from the crevice. After enduring considerable time upside down, John's legs throbbed with pain, necessitating frequent breaks during the extraction process. Nevertheless, they succeeded in hoisting him high enough for one rescuer to make eye contact with him. Though fatigued and in pain, John managed to smile amidst his ordeal. However, as they neared the final stages of extraction, disaster struck. The entire team fell backward when the rope slipped from their grasp, knocking the closest rescuer unconscious as a pulley broke free from the cave wall. Amidst the ensuing chaos, John slid deeper into the crevice, his condition worsening. The rescuers struggled to maintain their composure as they attempted to resume the rescue effort. Despite their relentless efforts, John's condition continued to deteriorate rapidly. Subsequent replacement rescuers endeavored to continue the operation, but John's responsiveness diminished, signaling a dire turn of events. Ultimately, a medical professional pronounced John dead at midnight on November 25, 2009, citing cardiac arrest as the cause of death. Despite the exhaustive efforts of 137 rescuers over 27 hours, they were unable to save John from the clutches of Nutty Putty Cave. Authorities deemed retrieving John's body too perilous, leading them to cement over the cave entrance, where his remains rest to this day. If you followed along this far, I want to express my gratitude for your attention. If you found this content engaging, please consider subscribing. Additionally, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to drop a comment below. Thank you once again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. The mountains of North Georgia are one of the most beloved and recognizable landscapes in the American South. Less known, however, is another natural phenomena that also appears here: caves. There are over 500 caves in Georgia, many of which can be found and explored in its northern mountainous region. The deepest and most intimidating of them all, however, is Ellisons Cave. As we're about to see, entering this cave is uniquely dangerous, and in the tragic case of 2 students from the University of Florida, it can even bring our worst nightmares to reality. Ellisons Cave is located on Pigeon Mountain, a remote summit about an hour's drive south of Chattanooga, Tennessee. The cave is definitely not a roadside attraction. To reach it, you have to drive way out into seriously rural territory, with only a few dirt roads and nothing to see but Georgia pines and thick shrubbery all around. Then, you have a considerable distance to travel on foot before you reach the mouth of the cave, more than 2,600 feet above sea level. There is one major reason why this cave is different from the rest of its neighbors. That reason is Fantastic. Fantastic is the name of the deepest cave drop in the continental US, and it is inside Ellisons Cave. This vertical tunnel descends straight down for so long that if the Space Needle from Seattle were placed at the bottom, only a few feet of antenna would stick out from the top. There are few caves in the world where you'll find a longer distance between you and the ground below you. An average adult who fell from the top of the pit could theoretically open a YouTube video and skip all the ads before hitting the bottom. It is a place that only the most experienced explorers are advised to go to, but sadly, that isn't always who finds their way out here. On Friday, February 11th, 2011, 18-year-old Michael Wayne Peary and 20-year-old Grant Lockenbach were on Pigeon Mountain. They were both students from the University of Florida in Gainesville, and they were there with 8 other people, all of whom wanted to explore Ellisons Cave. Walker County Sheriff Steve Wilson would later report that, in his opinion, the group had, quote, limited novice experience in caving. It's not uncommon for the North Georgia mountains to be sprinkled in snow during the winter months, and that day in February would have been quite cold. To reach the mouth of the cave, the group also had to ascend to a higher elevation, and pit caves tend to be even colder near their entrances during winter months, so it's likely that anyone in this group would have either been heavily bundled up or shivering upon reaching the mouth of Ellisons Cave. What happened next has never been fully explained. All we know is that a backpack, which belonged to someone in the group, fell into the cave. We don't know what was in the backpack, and we don't know for sure who it belonged to, but it seems likely it may have belonged to Grant Lockenbach because he chose to go in after it. Despite multiple warning signs posted outside the cave, and despite the fact that the backpack could have easily fallen hundreds of feet below, Lockenbach strapped himself in and began rappelling down, initiating a slow, untrained descent into one of the deepest cave drops on the planet. Rappelling down such a seemingly endless shaft with limited experience and no research ahead of time is something no experienced explorer would ever recommend. But Lockenbach showed some impressive determination in attempting to retrieve the fallen backpack because he eventually made it almost 150 feet down into the cave. It was at this dramatic point that disaster struck. Lockenbach suddenly became entangled in the rope. He also found himself stuck in the path of a waterfall, relentlessly dousing him in freezing cold water. Lockenbach immediately began hollering up to his friends, crying out for help. It was at this time that Michael Wayne Peary also strapped himself in and began descending to try and help Lockenbach. It's not clear whether Peary ever reached Lockenbach. All we know is that at some point during the descent, he too became stranded. Both Peary and Lockenbach were suspended in peril, unable to help each other and unable to ascend or descend. Meanwhile, the other 8 members of the group remained at the mouth of the cave. It may have been that Peary and Lockenbach were using all of the available equipment, or it may have been that the group decided it wasn't worth risking a third person getting stranded in the cave. Either way, the remaining 8 reportedly continued yelling down to Peary and Lockenbach, desperately trying to figure out how to get them out for about 20 to 30 minutes. Then, something truly haunting began to happen. According to Sheriff Wilson, who spoke with the group of 8 immediately after the incident, the voices of Peary and Lockenbach began, quote, fading off. There are a couple of disturbing explanations for this cryptic phase. One is that Peary and Lockenbach somehow got untangled and began descending even further into the cave. Far more likely, however, is that the 2 young men began experiencing symptoms of acute hypothermia. After losing contact with their friends, the panicked group ran to get help. Local authorities, including Walker County's cave and cliff rescue team, soon arrived on the scene. Even with a team of trained professionals working tirelessly, it took an astonishing 8 hours to retrieve the two young men. Sadly and horrifically, both died while suspended in the cave. A man representing Walker County Emergency Management, who was present at the scene, told reporters the following, quote, "With the apparel that they were apparently wearing, which was not conducive for this weather and the ice-cold water, within a very short period of time, it appears they were overcome by hypothermia. The apparel in question turned out to be shorts and t-shirts, which could have easily been less than ideal for cave exploration in warm weather, let alone near freezing temperatures." The man from Walker County Emergency Management also explained that the cave's extreme depth not only makes it dangerous, but one of the most technically challenging caves in the U.S. as well. Following this tragic incident, Sheriff Wilson warned the public that Ellisons Cave is, quote, "a treacherous, dangerous cave." There is one other reported instance of a caver getting stranded in Ellisons Cave, then dying of hypothermia. It happened back in 1999. There have also been a couple of other serious injuries in the years since. However, the tragic deaths of Michael Wayne Peary and Grant Lockenbach stand out as the most shocking and tragic event to befall this unique cave. Michael played drums in the Gator Marching Band and was studying marketing. Grant was studying sociology, and at 20 years old, he was close to graduation. The University of Florida held a candlelight vigil on campus following their deaths. This story is a heartbreaking reminder of how dangerous caving can be, particularly if you're not well equipped and lack the requisite experience.
Eagle's Nest is one of the most intimidating caves in the entire United States. Located near the coast of West Central Florida, it has been hypnotizing cave divers for years and sadly claimed many of their lives. Like a Bengal tiger, it is both mesmerizingly beautiful and deadly. It is widely regarded as one of the most dangerous cave diving sites, not just in the US, but on the face of the earth. Particularly named the Mount Everest of cave diving, it is strongly advised that only experienced professionals even consider attempting this site. But amazingly and tragically, as this story will show, even experienced divers can still fall prey to this apex predator of the caving world. Eagle's Nest is actually a sinkhole. Sinkholes are pretty frightening by nature. They are quite literally holes in the earth where the ground simply gave way and collapsed. Sinkholes have several different classifications, and some get created gradually while others collapse all at once. Either way, they often fill with water draining from the surface above, turning into what looks like random little swimming holes drilled into various locations around the globe. The hole in the earth known as Eagle's Nest is about an hour's drive north of Tampa, Florida, and only about 1 mile east off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of Florida's lakes and caving systems are admired and frequently photographed for their incredibly clear and inviting water. Not so with Eagle's Nest. The surface of this sinkhole is notoriously unattractive. For starters, it's green and it's usually covered with algae. There are bugs everywhere, mostly the kind that want to suck your blood, and there aren't really any places to sit and put your stuff. The actual sinkhole is surrounded on all sides by a kind of swampy muck that stretches for many yards in every direction. Shrek would feel right at home here. Perhaps worst of all, the water itself is surprisingly murky. Even if you get your legs muddy and stand directly above it, you can't see what's below. In a way, that's a shame, because it turns out what's below is one of the most extraordinary underwater worlds that humans have ever uncovered. Below the surface of this relatively small and swampy body of water is a labyrinth that descends 300 feet below the Earth's surface. The intricate network of pathways extends for over a mile. According to the experts, it's so amazing that it can actually be unsafe. One expert who says this is Sylvester Muller, who is the vice chairman of the National Speleological Society's cave diving section. He says Eagle's Nest is like a Venus flytrap. You get in there, and there is so much to see you get distracted, and it gets deep quickly. When Muller says there's lots to see, he's not just talking about the amazing network of underwater caves. He's also talking about the life forms that exist inside them. Because of the narrow passages inside Eagle's Nest and the numerous sections that sit in total darkness all the time, unusual animals live inside Eagle's Nest. One is the cave-adapted crayfish. This bizarre creature is as white as a sheet of paper. You can see through its body well enough to see its internal organs from the outside. Most amazingly, for reasons that scientists can't yet fully explain, They can live for as long as 200 years, despite the fact that they're stuck living in dark, maze-like caves such as Eagle's Nest, where there is barely ever any food around. Speaking of science, another reason Eagle's Nest seduces so many divers is because of the highly unusual organic environment. According to National Geographic, things like bacterial cultures and algal mats found here might be good representations of what life could look like on other planets. The cave is a boon for biologists as well as explorers, although surely there is some overlap between the two. The two things on this planet that we've explored the least, and therefore know the least about, are the world underwater and the world underground. Eagle's Nest is both of these worlds combined, making it one of the most alien environments you can ever visit. The event. Needless to say, the appeal of Eagle's Nest is obvious, and it gets many visitors despite being so dangerous. But since the early 1980s, no less than 10 people have died inside Eagle's Nest. In today's crazy world, where it seems like we hear about death and tragedy on the news every single day, that number may not seem as gigantic as it should. In the context of cave diving, a niche sport by nature, one single cave with a death toll in double digits is insane. It's so out of the ordinary that people living on the west central Florida coast have routinely begged for officials to close Eagle's Den permanently. Those calls grew particularly loud following the event that I'm about to describe. On the afternoon of Sunday, October 16, 2016, 3 divers made the trek out to Eagle's Nest in the hopes of exploring its hidden wonders. The 3 were there for a weekend trip, which was supposed to include 3 full days spent diving. They were Chris Rittenmeyer, Patrick Peacock, and Justin Blakely. All 3 were experienced divers, and both Chris Rittenmeyer and Patrick Peacock had even explored Eagle's Nest before. As they wandered under the shade of the pine trees, they would have seen multiple signs in regards to the sinkhole that was just around the corner. One in particular would have definitely stood out, as I'm sure it does to most people who visit Eagle's Nest. It is a large white sign that says in bold red letters, "Attention Scuba Divers." This sign is a reminder that all divers are strictly required to have completed a registration process before entering Eagle's Nest. In order to register, they must be scuba certified, and they must have the registration papers with them when they visit the area. This is a bold red indication that what you're about to do requires experience and qualification. It would not be the last warning sign the 3 men would see, nor the most disconcerting. Making their way past the sign, the 3 men would have soon come upon a small boardwalk. The boardwalk bridges the way over tall grass and muddy ground until it opens up to the treeless area where the sinkhole sits. Being the 2 in the group who had been there before, Rittenmeyer and Peacock probably went in first. They were intending to explore deeper areas of the cave than Justin Blakely, who was content to explore closer to the surface. There are 3 different tunnels you can take, fanning out somewhat evenly from the central spot where the cave entrance lies. Found along these tunnels are more than 6 dozen rooms, but the biggest and most famous is surely the Super Room. It's likely that both Rittenmeyer and Peacock would have wanted to explore this portion, meaning they would have had to travel down to the upstream tunnel. There is also a downstream tunnel with more rooms in it. These include the Half Moon Room, Jim's Room, and the Room of Dreams. All 3 of these are at least 200 or more feet deep. There's a stretch of the cave between Jim's room and another spot called the Pit, where the tunnel dips to 300 feet. It would have areas in the cave such as these that Peacock and Rittenmeyer were exploring together, while their other friend, Justin Blakely, explored higher up. The group reportedly entered the water at around 2 p.m. They had agreed on a meeting point to come back to exactly 1 hour later. As they descended together, they would have quickly run into a sight that is impossible to ignore, a large white sign with the image of the Grim Reaper on it. It seems like there are more than one of these signs in underwater caves around Florida, but it seems entirely possible that Eagle's Nest was the first cave to get that one, and the cave that inspired the disturbing sign in the first place. It says, "Stop, prevent your death, go no further." It then lists some facts about the dangers of cave diving, including the fact that more than 300 divers, including open water scuba instructors, have died in caves just like this one. At the bottom, it says simply and hauntingly, "There is nothing in this cave worth dying for." After exploring the upper regions of the cave, Blakely returned to the meeting point on time. He discovered that he was the only one there. Initially, this probably wasn't too surprising, given that he had been exploring much closer to the surface than Rittenmeyer and Peacock. But after some minutes had gone by, he started to get worried. I'm not sure precisely where the meeting room was, but after a half hour, Blakely returned to it. Once again, he was the only one there. There was no trace of Patrick Peacock or Chris Rittenmeyer. News reports made it sound as though Justin Blakely continued to check the meeting point, then check again and again, until about 6 p.m., 3 hours after the three friends were supposed to rejoin each other. At 6 p.m., he dialed 911. The aftermath. As you might imagine, Eagle's Nest is one of the worst places to try and look for missing divers. Not only is it incredibly deep, but it is also winding and narrow. It's almost like looking for someone inside the intestinal tract of the earth. Despite rescue crews running to the scene and beginning the search immediately, they looked all through the evening with no luck. The amount of time that had passed at this point sadly left little room for hope. It had been hours since they first descended, and scuba air tanks usually don't last much longer than 1 hour. At the extreme depth of the rooms in Eagle's Nest, that time would likely be shortened even further. The grim search continued until the following morning on October 17th. Given the circumstances, this must have felt like half an eternity. But finally, rescue made the tragic discovery everyone was dreading. The dead bodies of Chris Rittenmeyer and Patrick Peacock were found relatively close to each other. According to the sheriff's office in the surrounding county of Hernando, the two divers were found both in a very dangerous and complex area of the cave system. Rescue divers estimated that Chris and Patrick were trapped roughly 260 feet below the surface. To put this into perspective, that is only a few stories less than the full height of the Statue of Liberty, and they didn't have a straight shot to the top either. They were buried under a notoriously circuitous network of dark, narrow caves. Final thoughts. This was a horrific, horrific way to die. The story received nationwide media attention, even being covered on CBS Morning News. Like many stories about caving exploration gone wrong, most of the focus was put on the dangers of the cave and the tragic outcome, and as a result, it seems like there is no mystery. Dangerous cave, deadly accident. This seems like an especially complete explanation in the case of Eagle's Den, where it had already happened numerous times before. Clearly, something went really wrong with both Chris and Patrick's dives, but interestingly, on the National Speleological Society's online database, the incident type is listed as unknown. Throughout various news articles, TV segments, and other sources, I did not find a definitive answer as to what actually went wrong. In a cave as challenging as Eagle's Nest, there is quite a lot that could have gone wrong. Perhaps they didn't reserve the amount of gas they needed. Maybe they accidentally knocked around silt or sediment on the floor or walls that obscured their vision. One strong vulnerability in a winding cave like Eagle's Nest is making some kind of a mistake with the guideline they're running. It could be some combination of these factors, or it could be something else. Whatever it was, it trapped Chris Rittenmeyer and Patrick Peacock 260 feet down inside Eagle's Nest and ensured they never saw the light of day again. Do you think Eagle's Nest should be closed to the public? Post your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like the video and subscribe for more caving stories in the near future. That's all for now. I'll see you next time. Mammoth Cave is the longest cave system in the world. The cave system spreads out across 52,830 acres at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, while making it almost double the length of the second longest cave system. Explorers have unearthed human remains at the site. Some were part of ritual burials, and others died while exploring the cave's vast tunnels. The allure of Mammoth Cave brought explorers from far and wide to search for new entrances, and one intrepid explorer found a separate cave that became the site of a rescue operation that captivated the entire country. The most recent rescue operation in the Mammoth Cave area even happened earlier this year in 2022. Grab your lights and get ready to explore Mammoth Cave and the small cave nearby, which was home to one of the most tragic caving accidents in history. History and geography. Mammoth Cave is made from layers of limestone, otherwise known as strata, with a layer of sandstone on top. Both of these materials worked together over millions of years to develop the cave's intricate tunnels. and they combine to make the cave stronger and more resistant to tectonic shifts. The layer where the limestone and sandstone meet creates small passages in the cave's epicarstic zone. These small tunnels provide runoff to the lower limestone layer, which pools to form the Mammoth Cave's intricate tunnel system. The above-ground rivers lead to the southern region of the cave to create an enormous sinkhole known as the Cedar Sink, which extends 300 feet into the earth. The bottom of the Cedar Sink has a massive drainage area, which spreads out over 7 acres. The longest passage of Mammoth Cave stretches out to an astonishing 420 miles. Researchers and spelunkers have found mummified remains at Mammoth Cave dating back to the pre-Columbian era or prior to 1492. Another set of remains was found in 1935, crushed under a huge rock. Archaeologists call the Native American victim Lost John, and they believe he was a miner who accidentally broke a boulder above him, leading to a landslide. This body was later given a proper burial deeper within the cave. But it wouldn't be the only time a boulder would cause a tragedy in the vast Kentucky cave system. Mammoth Cave holds a special place in the history of archaeology as well. Researchers found artifacts that were used by ancient explorers who visited the cave. With these tools, researchers tested a technique called experimental archaeology, where teams would explore the cave without modern harnesses, lights, and other caving equipment. Instead, they tried exploring using recreations of the ancient technology they found in Mammoth Cave. This technique tested the equipment and technological level of ancient societies, and it gave researchers first-hand knowledge of the physical challenges the original cavers had to face. Mammoth Cave is also home to a vast underground river with rock formations that mirror Gothic architecture, like the Wells Cathedral and the Sainte Chapelle. During rainstorms, the interior of the cave can be shrouded in a layer of dense fog to create an unmistakably eerie atmosphere. The earliest written history of the cave dates back to the Pollard Survey in 1791, just 15 years after the American Declaration of Independence was signed. But stories say that the first non-Native American to enter the cave was Francis Houchin or John Houchin, who were hunting a bear that fled into the Mammoth Cave at its entrance by Green River. Shortly after it was first surveyed, Valentine Simons began mining the cave for saltpeter, one of the major ingredients in old gunpowder. For the next 50 years, the cave was bought and sold until Stephen Bishop began exploring the cave. Stephen was one of the first African-American cavers. At the time, he was forced to work in the cave since emancipation hadn't taken place yet. In spite of his tragic work conditions, Stephen became one of the first people to map out Mammoth Cave as he braved depths that no one had ever ventured to before. He served as a guide for tourists, and he christened the majority of the cave's famous features, and many of these names still stand to this day. Floyd Collins and the Mammoth Frenzy. In the early 1900s, Mammoth Cave was at the heart of the Kentucky Cave Wars, where local companies fought to attract tourists to the various caves in the area. Landowners and cave tour guides would sabotage competitors with fake signs to drive people away from Mammoth Cave, since it was the biggest attraction in the area. Eventually, the cave became accessible by steamboat, and numerous explorers tried to map out the cave over the next few years until 1925, when Floyd Collins traveled to Mammoth Cave, turning it from a local tourist hotspot to a national news headliner. Floyd Collins was an American caver born on July 20, 1887. He started exploring caves when he was just 6 years old, and he was already well on his way to becoming an entrepreneur. Even at this early age, Floyd was searching for Native American artifacts to sell to tourists who were visiting Mammoth Cave. At 13, Collins discovered his first cave on his family's farm. He named it Donkey's Cave, and he continued to find more caves like the Dosey's Dome Cave. In 1917, Collins excavated a rock breakdown to discover a sinkhole leading to a new cave. He dubbed it the Great Crystal Cave, or the Great Onyx Cave, which is a part of the Flint River cave system, and it would end up connecting to Mammoth Cave. Since the cave was on his land, his family did their best to turn it into a tourist attraction. The cave was breathtaking, but it was too impractical to be a tourist destination, so Collins searched for another cave that he could show off to get a slice of the revenue from the ongoing Kentucky Cave Wars. Because of Mammoth Cave's huge attraction, Collins wanted to find another entrance to the cave to capitalize on the namesake and win over more customers. A few weeks later, and Collins found a small hole. He dug around it and found that this hole was a cave entrance. He called it Sand Cave and began advertising the cave. Collins spent over 12 hours every day working to excavate a larger pathway to Sand Cave and create his new tourist destination. A new entrance or a coffin? On January 30th, 1925, Collins was crawling through tight, narrow tunnels when he found a grotto chamber. Excited by his discovery, Floyd took extra time exploring the place, and he lost track of how low he was on lamplight. He quickly left the grotto and tried to speed through the tight passages to the surface. In his frantic rush, he jerked, knocking over his lamp. As the flames died out, leaving him in a casket of darkness, Floyd's sudden motion sent up a vibration on the side of the passageway, knocking a 27-pound boulder that pinned his leg to the floor of the cave. As a veteran caver, Floyd could easily lift the boulder in normal circumstances, but he was stuck in a cramped crawl space, and he didn't have the proper leverage to move the stone. He was trapped 150 feet from the exit of Sand Cave. When Collins didn't arrive home, his business associates went searching for him. They quickly found that he was stuck in the unexcavated cave, and they sent him crackers for some nourishment as they formulated a plan. The team quickly assembled fellow cavers, engineers, and geologists across the state to rescue Collins. They sent him an electric light so he could see, and the bulb helped provide some much-needed warmth in the damp crevice. The team worked around the clock for weeks. On February 4th, the passage Collins initially entered collapsed in 2 different places. The rescue ops determined the entrance unsafe, so the team brought in miners to dig a shaft to extract Collins from the cave. Meanwhile, the story spread like wildfire in the cave-crazed region of Kentucky. Small carts and wagons opened up vending shops near the rescue base, selling beverages, food, and even souvenirs to thousands of spectators hungry for the drama of the trapped caver. Reports quickly spread to national news outlets thanks to the efforts of William Burke Miller, a famous newspaper and radio reporter. Miller was small enough to fit in the partially collapsed entrance to Sand Cave, so he went as far as he could into the most dangerous part of the cave to interview Floyd. He would later win the Pulitzer Prize for his journalistic efforts. Back at Sand Cave, the hordes of sightseers got so massive that Kentucky officials dispatched their state troops to keep the peace. The mining crew dug a 55-foot shaft followed by a horizontal tunnel to the side of Collins. It took the crew 17 days to reach him, but they were too late. On February 16th, Ed Brenner, one of the miners, reached Collins to find him cold and dead. The crew tried to send a doctor down, but he was unable to reach Collins. They brought Floyd's friend, Johnny Geralds, into the tunnel to identify, and he was pronounced dead. The access tunnel was positioned too far to the side of Collins, so the team couldn't remove the rock, and Collins was buried in Sand Cave. Months later, he was exhumed and buried at the Mammoth Cave Baptist Church Cemetery. To make the tragedy even worse, Collins' dream was impossible, even if he had made it out. Sand Cave wasn't connected to Mammoth Cave. He died searching for an entrance that wasn't there. The huge publicity of the tragedy caused local officials to band together to create the Mammoth Cave National Park, which still exists today. The 2022 Scare. On February 20th, 2022, Mammoth Cave itself made headlines when reports rang out about a woman trapped in the sprawling abyss. Original reports hinted that a novice tourist suffered a fall, but in truth, the woman was a 60-year-old experienced spelunker. She was working on an expedition with the CRF, the Cave Research Foundation, to explore unmapped portions of the world's longest cave. The Cave Research Foundation started because of the Kentucky Cave Wars and the frenzy over Mammoth Cave. They studied the Floyd Collins Crystal Cave and branched out to other caves in the area. Now they're part of the National Speleological Society, and they sponsor expeditions to help protect and conserve caves and to advance more research into caves. The CRF was still finding new entrances to the Mammoth Cave as recently as 2005. The CRF researcher was 2.5 miles into the vast underground labyrinth of Mammoth Cave when she fell and injured her shoulder. It took emergency medical services and park officials 2.5 hours to traverse the path to her. Luckily, the cave area was still intact, unlike what happened to Collins. Because she was an adept caver, she was actually able to aid in her own rescue. With the help of the team at Mammoth Cave National Park, she was able to walk out of the cave, and she was treated at a local hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. You don't have to be a top-level spelunker to explore Mammoth Cave. The National Park in Kentucky provides tours to Mammoth Cave, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Some of the tours can last up to 6 hours, and others divert from the well-traveled areas into muddy passages that more closely resembled an untamed cave. That's the dark history of how one man risked everything to find a new entrance to Mammoth Cave on his journey for riches and glory that ended up being his doom. Have you ever been to Mammoth Cave? What cave stories should we cover next? Let us know in the comments section. While you're there, rappel down and hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss out on our next heart-pounding video. Stephen's Gap is one of the most beautiful caves in the world. Its massive pit, with an almost biblical beam of sunlight cascading from above, is tailor-made for Hollywood movies. The entrance to the pit is supposedly one of the most photographed in North America, and it's easy to see why. But despite its apparent serenity, Stephen's Gap is also known for devouring explorers alive, and recently the gap has claimed more lives than usual. Stephen's Gap is located in Jackson County, Alabama, about 30 miles east of the state's most populous city, Huntsville. It's fairly easy to reach by car. If you're traveling from Huntsville, the drive will only take you about a half hour. The entrance to the Stephen's Gap Callahan Cave Preserve is only a little ways off the freeway, making it much more accessible than other similar caves around the world. While it's easy to travel there, actually getting into the cave is more complicated. In order to visit Stephen's Gap, you're required by law to get a permit. The preserve is privately owned, and Stephen's Gap is protected by the Southeastern Cave Conservancy, the largest land conservancy in the world dedicated entirely to protecting caves. This sounds intimidating, but aside from the mild inconvenience, these permits are probably fairly easy to get. One of the unique things about Stephen's Gap is that you don't have to be an experienced cave diver to go inside it. In fact, it is possible to walk into the main pit with no more equipment than some decent hiking boots. Some visitors have even been able to camp inside the cave, although other sources give the impression this has either never been allowed or is not allowed anymore. Most people seem to agree the permits are a good thing, as they help regulate the influx of visitors and preserve the cave. Even with the permit requirement, the cave is still a very popular spot, with applicants needing to reserve their time slot around 2 to 3 weeks in advance. It's safe to assume the majority of visitors to Stephen's Gap do so on foot. However, there is a smaller subset of more daring visitors who opt to rappel down. Doing this can be both visually stunning and adrenaline pumping. From the opening in the ceiling, measured from the edge of the hole, the bottom of the pit is a whopping 143 feet directly below. This large vertical passageway, which is often described as the keyhole, is quite wide and roughly cylindrical in shape. This is the spot from which sunlight pours into the underground cavern, and it is arguably one of the main features that makes this such a popular spot for photographers. To descend midair along this ray of sunlight is nothing short of a caving enthusiast's dream, but it is not for those who don't have proper equipment or lots of prior experience. Frighteningly, even when you're experienced and you bring all the necessary gear with you, things can still go wrong. At Stephen's Gap, when they do go wrong, they go really wrong. And in 2019, more than one unfortunate visitor met their demise at the bottom of Stephen's Gap. Event 1. Juan Gerardo Cruces. The first life to be claimed by Stephen's Gap was that of Juan Gerardo Cruces. Juan was from Madison, a small city on the opposite side of Huntsville from Stephen's Gap. Juan was born in November 1994, so in the spring of 2019, he was just 24 years old. According to reports, Juan left his home on Thursday, April 11th, to go hiking by himself. All that was apparently known by friends and family at the time was that he was planning to hike in Jackson County. It's possible that Juan himself wasn't sure where exactly he wanted to hike. After all, traveling alone leaves ample room for spontaneity. Although we don't know for sure, it seems likely that going off to spend the day alone hiking was not unusual for Juan, as there are no reports that his family was worried about him, at least not at first. However, When Juan never came back that evening, his family filed a missing persons report. The following day, which was Friday, April 12th, the Jackson County Police began an investigation into the whereabouts of Juan Gerardo Cruces. Knowing that Juan was out hiking probably helped to narrow the search right from the beginning, but the police still had a fairly large range of possible places to look. Jackson County is well over 1,000 square miles, and there are numerous areas full of hiking trails. After some time, Jackson County Police came across Juan Gerardo Cruces' car, in the place they were probably least hoping to find it, the parking lot at Stevens Gap Callahan Cave Preserve. This must have sent a chill down the spines of the officers. Stevens Gap is a well-known landmark in the area and not at all a place you want to have to look for a missing person. Fearing the worst, Jackson County Police quickly notified the Scottsboro-Jackson County Rescue Squad, who came to help search the area. They searched all over the park, the trails, and even in some parts of the cave. However, due to the obvious need for highly specialized equipment, the crew wasn't able to fully search the cave. Even though they hadn't found any trace of Juan Gerardo Cruces, the crew knew they needed to make absolutely sure that every inch of the cave had been thoroughly covered. Before leaving to continue the search elsewhere, they called the Huntsville Cave Rescue Unit. As their title suggests, this unit showed up with all the necessary equipment and expertise to descend into Stevens Gap and conduct a total search of the infamous keyhole. Sadly, against the hopes of everyone on the scene, it was at this point that the body of Juan Gerardo Cruces was found. He had fallen all the way down the 143-foot keyhole to a horrific death at the very bottom. We have only a couple clues as to the state of Juan's body upon discovery. The first is that Jackson County Sheriff Chuck Phillips was able to identify the body as being that of Juan. Considering the type of damage one can imagine a fall like this causing, this is frankly amazing. Although we don't exactly know how Sheriff Phillips was able to make the identification. The second is that officials chose not to order an autopsy. So while Juan Gerardo Cruces was still recognizable, the fact that he had fallen and been killed was so obvious to those at the scene that they felt no need to investigate any further. Aftermath of event number 1. Even if the causes of death, in the most immediate sense, was crystal clear, there are still many questions that should have been raised. Why was a hiker going anywhere near the opening to Stevens Gap in the first place? As I mentioned earlier, Stevens Gap is unique in that there is a walkable path to get inside the cave from another entry point. How is it nobody saw or heard anything? This is a popular cave. Visitors come and go every day, and some apparently even camp overnight. A person falling down the 140-foot keyhole and landing at the bottom seems like just about the most noticeable thing that could possibly happen inside Stevens Gap, and yet there are no witnesses. Was the cave empty? Did Juan fall in the middle of the night? Also, why was he there in the middle of the night? Another question, which is probably least to cross the mind of anyone who hears this story, is that of whether Juan fell or jumped. I can't speculate on this because I don't know Juan and haven't spoken to anyone from his family or friend group. However, I can tell you that, assuming they were doing the jobs diligently, Jackson County Police would have absolutely considered this possibility and pursued it, and they ruled Juan's death an accident. Even then, there's still a sense that not every question has been answered with this story. How did Juan accidentally fall into one of the most famous landmarks in the county, especially if he was an experienced hiker who was familiar with the nature in the area? In the end, Juan tragically took most of the answers to the bottom of Stevens Gap with him. Event number 2, Philip Whitehead. Juan Gerardo Cruces would not turn out to be the only person claimed by Stevens Gap in 2019. Just a few months later, a young man named Philip Whitehead was visiting Jackson County on vacation. Whitehead was from Florida. He was also serving in the military at the time and was stationed at Fort Campbell, which is about 3 hours north of Jackson County. One of the items on Whitehead's itinerary was visiting Stevens Cave with one of his friends. Being an adventure-seeking young man, Whitehead wanted to try rappelling down the infamous keyhole. It's not clear what level of experience he had with rappelling, although his being in the military probably increases the likelihood that he had some experience and certainly increases the likelihood that he was at least in good overall physical condition. His friend, however, was definitely experienced with rappelling. In fact, multiple reports say that his friend had actually rappelled down Stephen's Gap more than once before. Going to the cave, the two brought plenty of equipment. I would also assume that they acquired the necessary permits, although we don't know this for sure, and as we'll see later, we have at least some reason to doubt it. The descent started out like any other. The two harnessed themselves in, checked, double-checked, gave themselves the green light, and stepped over the edge. I doubt they went at the same time, even though it is possible they did. Given that they probably didn't, I would guess that Philip Whitehead went first. It would make some sense, as his more experienced friend could provide more guidance in the very beginning of his descent if he needed it. But the main reason I'm guessing this is because Philip's friend is still alive. Disaster struck Philip at some point as he was making his long and spacious descent through the sunlit vertical tunnel. Multiple reports, which one assumes rely on the testimony of Philip's friend and maybe other witnesses as well, state that a loud pop was heard. Officials would later speculate that this pop could have been the sound of the rope snapping or the breaking of the metal carabiner which attached Philip to the rope. Either way, it was quite literally the worst thing that could have happened. Philip's gradual descent was immediately transformed into a total free fall. Even more tragically, his friend was powerless to help as he watched his friend plummet to his inevitable death. Once again, the Huntsville Cave Rescue Unit was called to duty. They were able to recover the lifeless body of Philip Whitehead, who became the second young man in just a few months to have his life tragically cut short at Stephen's Gap. Aftermath of event number 2. This was enough to inspire a significant public effort on the part of local officials to try and educate the public and encourage safer behavior. Brian Bailey, the chief of operations for the Huntsville Cave Rescue Unit, made the following public statement shortly after Philip Whitehead's death. If you plan on visiting the site, go to the Southeastern Cave Conservancy website and get a permit. Stay on the marked trails and stay away from the edge of the pit. Use good common sense. This statement seems to imply that neither Philip Whitehead nor Juan Gerardo Cruces had permits and that neither one of them was using good common sense. But is that true? Juan Gerardo Cruces most likely wasn't planning on entering Stephen's Gap at all, so the issue of whether or not he had a permit is irrelevant. The opinion of those who worked the case and the available information all seem to suggest that his death was an accident, which could very well have been prevented being more careful, as Bailey suggests. But somehow that doesn't seem like a satisfactory solution. The fact that Juan, a young, fit 24-year-old, accidentally fell down one of the largest and most well-known keyholes in the country is quite odd, and we don't really know how it happened, because as far as we know, no one was there to witness it. As for Philip Whitehead, we have no reason to doubt that he and his friend both acquired the necessary permits, other than Brian Bailey seemingly implying that they didn't, and that if they had, somehow that would have prevented the tragedy. Whitehead was a young military man who brought an experienced friend and the necessary equipment. It would be strange if, despite all this thoughtful preparation, they both somehow neglected the legally required permits that one would assume they'd have to sneak into the preserve without. Final thoughts. I think the truth is that Brian Bailey, the Huntsville Cave Rescue Unit, and other officials simply don't know what else to do. Encouraging the public to be careful and to make sure they follow all the rules seems like natural reactions to these two successive events. But neither suggestion really addresses anything that either of the victims did wrong. The much darker reality that perhaps no one wants to address is that disasters like these can simply happen without warning. Competent, responsible people who know what they're doing and have done it before can still fall prey to the very thing their experience and precaution are supposed to prevent. All it takes is one slip, one snapped rope, one step too far in the wrong direction. Do you think the deaths of Juan Gerardo Cruces and Philip Whitehead could have been prevented? Post your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like the video and subscribe for more caving stories in the near future. That's all for now. I'll see you next time.
We're approaching the anniversary of one of the most dreadful cave stories of all time. In Thailand, on June 23, 2018, 12 members from a youth junior soccer team named the Wild Boars ventured into the Tam Luang Nang Nong Cave for a birthday party after a tough day of practice. The team of 12 boys aged 11 to 17 were chaperoned by their assistant coach Ekafon Chantuang. The whole event was catered, and it should have been a simple, fun time for the team. But their relaxing party underground quickly turned into a fight for survival when a monsoon stormed through the dense forest, bringing a sudden flood of water that wouldn't let up. The downpour sealed the entrance to the cave, trapping 13 people in the damp, rocky depths. Pirapat Sompiangje had just turned 17, but the rainfall was an unwelcome surprise for the birthday boy and the rest of the party. The tunnel leading to their party area was slanted downward, so the water started flooding inside and filling up narrow portions of the tunnel. The escape route was already too far to swim to safety. The team's assistant coach had to act fast to save the boys from the rising water. As they fled deeper into the cave, they left behind some of their food and supplies. Fleeing might have been their only option, but it presented a host of new problems. There are many different kinds of caves. None of them are comfortable to be trapped in, but some are worse than others. The Tam Luang Cave is a karstic cave formed by erosion of small rocks like limestone and dolomite. These caves create vast expanses of twisting and winding tunnels that extend for miles underground. The wild boars were drawn further into the cave dubbed the Great Cave of the Sleeping Lady, near the top of the Doi Nang Nong mountain in the Thai highlands. Legend has it that long ago a princess fell in love with a farm worker and planned to have a child out of wedlock. The royal family would forbid their marriage, so the princess and her sweetheart ran away and hid in the cave. The man left to search for food, but the royal family, led by the princess's father, caught the man and killed him. In her sorrow, the princess stabbed herself to death, and her blood became the water that courses through the veins of the Tam Luang Cave. As ages passed, the mountain itself grew into her likeness, and now the mountain range resembles the princess with long hair lying down. The boys and their chaperone had to contend with superstition, but more pressing matters were quickly taking over. The main chamber where the party was held is almost 300 feet long, but this main area branches into a labyrinth of narrow tunnels and vertical recesses that stretch for 6.4 miles in total. Soul-crushing darkness. Shortly after nightfall, the head coach for the team, Naparat Kantawang, looked at his phone and found over 20 missed calls. As he checked his messages, he realized that none of the boys had made it home. He called the assistant coach and dialed some of the boys' cell phones, but the signals were blocked by the dense forest and solid stone that entombed the soccer team. Eventually, Naparat actually contacted one of the boys. Songpong was picked up by his parents after soccer practice, and he told the coach that the rest of the team went to explore the Great Cave of the Sleeping Lady. The coach took personal responsibility for the team and his assistant, and he fled his house to reach the mouth of the cave. As he arrived in the pouring rain, he saw bags and bicycles all abandoned as rainwater and mud gushed from the sealed entrance of Tam Luang. Then, the head coach contacted authorities to report 13 missing people. Word quickly spread as police gathered tracking canines to probe the surface for sinkholes and shafts that could reach down into the cave as an escape route. At the time, radar and other scanning equipment wasn't strong enough to locate the team from the surface. Drones were also used to explore the cave to little success. Meanwhile, social media, word of mouth, and news coverage all caught the attention of world-class divers. Vern Unsworth is a British national who lives in the area. He's also a cave explorer, or caver who's explored the Tam Luang Cave complex many times, and he suggested that the Thai government contact the British Cave Rescue Council. 2 days after the team went missing, Thai Navy SEAL divers came to the rescue, only they didn't succeed. The monsoon brought continuous rain that churned up sediment and made the water almost opaque. Their special underwater lights were no use. They couldn't see anything when they tried to swim into the cave. Days passed, and more rain continued to flood into Tam Luang. On June 27th, 3 members of the British Cave Rescue Council made it to Thailand, and shortly afterward, more independent teams came to lend their aid. The BCRC brought better equipment designed specially for cave rescues, but their searches were fruitless. All the while, the wild boars and their coach were stuck wandering through damp, stagnant air as the thin, waning light from their dying flashlights cast ominous, ghastly shadows on the stalactites and stalagmites that threatened to engulf them around every turn. The next day, the 353rd Special Operations Group, the 320th Special Tactics Squadron, and the 31st Rescue Squadron from the U.S. Air Force arrived. A day later, a special specialist response group from the Australian Federal Police arrived, followed by Chinese divers from the Beijing Peaceland Foundation. Maxim Polyaka, Richard Stanton, Ben Raymanon, and John Valanthan made headway on the rescue by placing diving guidelines, but the mission had to be paused when more rain created strong currents. On July 2nd, 9 days after the boys and their coach went missing, the weather finally let up. That day, BCRC diver Robert Harper conducted support from outside the cave as 2 divers explored the depths. Valanthan and Stanton were exploring the cave, placing guidelines. Valanthan ran out of line and swam to the surface. He smelled something immediately recognizable. As he looked around the chamber, he found the missing birthday party, alive but sweaty, dirty, exhausted, and frightened. The Thai Navy SEALs posted a video of this miracle encounter to Facebook. In the video, the boys have all lost sense of time. The darkness had eroded their senses and fear has dulled their otherwise smiling faces. Although it was a blessing to find the team alive, the battle was far from over. The group was found in a chamber that lay deep beneath the highest point of the mountain. To reach it from the surface, nearly half a mile of rock would need to be excavated, but the horizontal path was just as bad. The group was roughly 2.5 miles from the entrance, and the path toward them was riddled with steep slopes and narrow corridors that were too small to carry scuba tanks through. It dawned on rescuers that the real challenge was just beginning. Any capable swimmer can tackle a mile-long swim in around 30 minutes, but this situation was much more dire. The winding caverns meant that divers had to traverse carefully. Any wrong move could risk slicing their equipment or their flesh open on the jagged rocks that surrounded them from all sides. Plus, rescuers needed to carry extra equipment and supplies to deliver to the trapped soccer team, which would also slow them down. The weight of the mission would impact their very physiology, causing their adrenaline to spike as they breathe faster under the pressure of saving so many innocent lives. As they breathe faster, their oxygen tanks deplete faster. And there's one final problem: the return trip. The average scuba tank can only hold enough air for 45 to 60 minutes. The high stakes and difficult terrain could cause rescuers to spend far longer than an hour just to reach them, not counting the time to return back to the entrance to refill their tanks. To make matters worse, some of the boys never learned how to swim. To make supply trips more efficient, the team set up an air supply refill area in a chamber partway through the cave. Thai Army doctor Lieutenant Colonel Pak Laharachan joined the team to provide health checks on the boys. The rescue team realized the importance of morale and positive psychology, so they also tried to keep the team entertained as best as they could in the muddy nightmare they were trapped in. To raise their own spirits and give hope to their families, the team each introduced themselves in a video posted by the Thai Navy SEALs. While the effort was noble, the team looked frail as they huddled in emergency blankets. In a more genuine effort of kindness, BCRC diver Jason Mallinson asked each team member if they wanted to send personal messages to their friends and family in writing. Jason had with him a special wet notes pad that could write on land or underwater. Meanwhile, their coach Ekafon also played a vital role in keeping the boys safe despite his blunder of ignoring the warning signs posted at the cave entrance. Alongside soccer, he also trained as a Buddhist monk. He led the boys in guided meditation, which has been scientifically shown to reduce anxiety and improve other areas of health, and it may have helped them process the trauma they were faced with day after day, trapped in the abyss. On the surface, an entire camp was constructed to figure out how the team would rescue the 13 people trapped in Tam Luang. The team discovered it took them 6 hours to reach the boys because they had to battle against the current, and it took them 5 hours to exit. To make it easier for the divers, different teams constructed a dam to divert upstream rivers, and other teams created a pump system to remove as much water as they could from the rapidly flooding cave. By July 4th, experts estimated that they had pumped out 420,000 gallons of water, which is close to the total volume of an Olympic swimming pool. This helped the divers, but it also flooded nearby farms and destroyed their crops. The rescuers were also surprised by an unusual dry spell that helped reduce the water level in the cave. On July 5th, 38-year-old former Thai Navy SEAL diver Saman Keenan volunteered to help, and he dove into the cave to deliver 3 air tanks to the Midway refill site. He dropped off the tanks, but on his own way back, he lost consciousness. His dive partner attempted CPR, but he was unsuccessful. They went back to Chamber 3 with the air tanks, and Keenan's dive buddy tried CPR again, but it was too late. Keenan was pronounced dead in the early hours of July 6th. Tragically, this wasn't the only life claimed in the Tam Luang rescue operation. A year after the heroic mission, another Thai SEAL, Beirut Pakbera, died from a blood infection he acquired in the cave. Later that day, on July 6th, the rescue camp detected low oxygen levels in the chamber where the boys were waiting to be rescued, which could lead to hypoxia and permanent damage or even death if they weren't rescued soon. 2 days later, oxygen levels dropped below the levels needed for normal human function. Time was running out. Weather forecasters predicted that another monsoon was fast approaching. By the end of the week, the cave would be reflooded and the rain wouldn't recede for another 3 months. The team had days to save the boys and their coach, or they were doomed. On July 8th, the extraction began. 18 rescue divers took part in the mission, and the boys were rescued in order of who volunteered first. The days of good food and encouragement helped the boys face the challenge head-on, as they were filled with hope for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Some of the wild boars weren't looking forward to the bike ride home after a grueling time trapped in a cave. It hadn't dawned on them that the whole world was supporting them and hoping for their rescue. All 12 boys and their coach were given wetsuits, harnesses, buoyancy jackets, and positive pressure full face masks that were attached to tanks with 80% oxygen on their chest. The harnesses had handles that allowed them to be tethered to a rescue diver for added safety if they got lost in the low visibility areas of the cave. To prevent panic, the boys were also given a cocktail of drugs. The first was a drug known for both its anesthetic and psychedelic properties, ketamine. The dosage was enough to knock them out without interfering with their breathing. They were also given Xanax and atropine to prevent anxiety and keep their heart rate steady. These drugs needed to be administered multiple times along the journey to freedom. Once the boys reached Chamber 3, where the oxygen was stored, they were passed along a chain of hundreds of rescuers, wrapped in sked stretchers, slid, zip-lined, and carried by a system of pulleys to the entrance of the cave. On July 10th, the last of the boys and the coach were rescued. The last people to leave were the 3 Thai Navy SEALs and the Army doctor. But as they were leaving, the water pumps were suddenly shut off. Thankfully, they were the most experienced members of the group by this point, and they were able to escape in record time before the rising water levels cut off the exit. After 18 days, the wild boars and their assistant coach were free from the Tam Luang cave. The boys were placed on a special diet and given sunglasses so they could readjust to regular light for the first time in weeks. When all was said and done, roughly 10,000 people helped in some capacity during the Tam Luang cave incident. Over 100 divers lent their aid, and over 100 government agencies took part in the rescue effort. An episode of National Geographic's Drain the Oceans, called Thai Cave Rescue, recalls the events. Thai-Irish filmmaker Tom Waller wrote and directed a movie called The Cave, which is based on Tam Luang. And just last year, in 2021, a full documentary was released called The Rescue. That's the exhilarating story of the Tam Luang Cave Rescue. What hair-raising moments surprised you the most? Let us know in the comment section below. While you're there, click that like and subscribe button to explore more chilling cave stories. And we'll see you in the next video coming your way soon.
If someone invited you to visit a place called Ellisons Cave, would you go? What if they told you it was also sometimes referred to by locals as the Cave of Death? This sounds like something from a fantasy novel, but it is in fact real. In Provo, Utah, directly east of Brigham Young University, there is a large mountain with the letter Y inscribed on the side. This signifies the name of the university. This scenic mountain, which is creatively called Y Mountain, may look tranquil, but it hides a dark and haunting secret. The cave known as Ellisons Cave presents itself as a large opening in the side of Y Mountain. Those who make the daring venture into it soon find that it is a long, descending tunnel. The tunnel lowers you deeper and deeper below the surface of the mountain until, some 90 feet later, it drops you off in a large pool of water. The pool is roughly 6 feet deep and 15 feet across, which is strikingly similar to the kind of pool you might find at a rec center. The only difference is it's located inside Y Mountain. The reason for its existence is that Ellisons Cave is actually a cave that intersects with an old abandoned mine. The appeal of such a remarkable place just off campus is obvious, especially for young college students. However, it is also a remarkably dangerous place, as this shocking story will show. Our story takes us back in time a bit, to when YouTube was still a brand new website most people hadn't heard of yet. In the year 2005, CPL Productions released a new movie in the UK called The Descent. It tells the story of a group of friends who decide to explore a cave in the remote wilderness of North Carolina. The group gets trapped inside the underground labyrinth of caves and has to contend with crawlers, vicious and bloodthirsty creatures described by at least one movie critic as being similar to Gollum from Lord of the Rings. The movie went on to be a major success, both commercially and critically. It made almost $60 million at the box office and received tons of praise from film critics who seemed to agree that it was a fresh and engaging concept. Today, the movie is often ranked on lists of the best horror movies, and more significantly, it is seen as having pioneered a new genre of horror that has since been frequently imitated but never quite matched. Writer and director Neil Marshall tapped into something that seems to both captivate and terrify the human imagination. There's something about climbing down deeper and deeper into a cave with no knowledge of how far it goes or what is hiding down inside it that is hard to look away from. The Descent first debuted in UK theaters on July 8, 2005. The timing of this is extraordinary. Just 1 month later, in Provo, Utah, something would happen in real life that followed the plot line of the movie quite closely. The cast of characters for this story was 24-year-old Blake Donner, 21-year-old Jennifer Galbraith, 18-year-old Ariel Singer, and 28-year-old Scott McDonald. It is very unlikely that any of these young men and women have ever heard of the movie The Descent because it didn't come out in the United States until 2006, the following year. That makes their story even more strange because they clearly weren't inspired by the movie to try and replicate it. It's simply by tragic coincidence that these 4 people decided one day in August that they wanted to wander down into a dark, mysterious cave together. And since they were all residents of Utah County, they were close to such a place and had probably heard rumors about it for years. Unlike some other, more professionally explored caves, Gollum's Cave doesn't show up on a map. You can certainly find Y Mountain hugging right up against the edge of Provo's urban sprawl, but good luck using Google to figure out where it is. Back in 2005, it seems inevitable that the 4 would have had to have known where the cave was through word of mouth or by someone in the group having already been there before. Sources say that the location of the cave has always been a closely guarded secret. However, a blogger named Israel Niederhauser, who once explored the cave and lived to tell the tale, says that the hike to get there is several hours long, including 1 to 2 hours of hiking without any trail. Niederhauser had to figure out the location himself by scouring old news articles, combing over maps, and even speaking with a local who claimed that a Navajo medicine man told him there was gold buried inside a cave with water running through it. How Blake, Jennifer, Ariel, and Scott knew where to find the cave is something we'll never know definitively, but chances are really high that it wasn't everyone's first time visiting. It may, however, have been the first time they all decided to try and travel, all the way down. On the evening of Wednesday, August 17, 2005, 5 friends were having dinner together in Provo, Utah. They were the 4 people I mentioned earlier, plus another friend named Steve Hundley. As usual with a group of close friends, conversation was lively, and at some point the dinner wore on. Someone at the table asked the group if they had ever heard about the Cave of Death. Presumably, the answer was no, because whoever brought it up then went on to describe the cave. It's very unlikely that whoever brought it up had been to the cave before, and was probably the only one in the group who had. It might be helpful if we could know who it was, but sadly, we don't know for sure. However, at least one source suggests that it was one of the 2 women. Whoever it was, they did a good job of making the Cave of Death sound appealing, because the group was soon convinced that tonight was the night to try and explore it. Well, that is, everyone except for Steve Hundley. Apparently, Steve had also been to the cave before, in fact somewhat recently, and despite the enthusiasm around him, he didn't feel comfortable going back. After dinner, Steve separated from the group, and the remaining 4 invited another friend named Joseph Ferguson. Why they were so intent on having 5 people is anybody's guess. Maybe they thought it would be safer with that number. Even though that seems like the most likely explanation, one thing we can be sure of is that the journey this group of 5 proceeded to embark on was anything but safe. Remember, the hike to reach this remote cave is at least several hours long, and the group had just finished eating dinner. It was probably dark outside before they even left. Provo is usually pretty warm in the summertime, and that night it wasn't raining, so they wouldn't have had to worry about the weather too much. However, they did have to contend with hiking in extreme darkness. Once you move out of Provo and around the side of Y Mountain, you move from the familiar glow of a populous urban area to the vast shadows of total wilderness. The area behind Y Mountain appears to be one of the least populated in the country. There are barely any roads, let alone towns, and if you travel on foot, you won't reach a major highway until you cross Route 40 some 20 miles away. Provo is 4,500 feet above sea level, and the top of Y Mountain is 4,000 feet higher than that. So on a clear night, the light from the stars might be brighter than most would expect. But still, in such a rural area, the group would certainly have needed flashlights. And even then, it would have been an artist's task to find their way all the way back to where Gollum's Cave, or the Cave of Death, lay waiting for them. Somehow, they made it. By the time the group reached the mouth of the cave, it was 2 or 3 in the morning. It was at this point that Joseph Ferguson, the 5th friend who they invited after dinner, decided he'd rather not go inside. There appear to be some conflicting reports about this. It's possible that he initially went into the cave, but then turned around at some point. Either way, what we know for sure is that Joseph ended up waiting outside while the other 4, Blake, Jennifer, Ariel, and Scott, descended. At this point, we have to rely on Joseph's testimony of what happened. He claims that after about 45 minutes, he started to get worried. He says he called some friends who he knew were familiar with this cave and asked for advice. Their advice appears to have been to call the police, so that's what Joseph did. Something odd about this is the fact that Joseph, in 2005, apparently had cell reception at the location. It is also somewhat miraculous that authorities were able to figure out where he was, given that it was in the middle of the forest and way off any trail. But luckily, they were, and they started the rescue operation immediately. The crew used pumps to send air into the cave and to remove some of the water from the pool at the bottom. After some time spent doing this, they were able to see all 4 bodies, dead, floating, and facing the same direction. All 4 were at the opposite end of the pool, facing the entrance. This haunting image poses many questions, which we'll get to in a moment, but at the time of the discovery, all anybody could think about was the indescribable horror of this discovery. 4 young friends had all died shocking deaths right next to each other at the same time. News of the tragedy spread quickly all across Utah as dawn broke over Y Mountain. Almost immediately, city officials ruled to have the cave sealed off to prevent anyone else from meeting a similar fate. Today, there is a sign at the location to commemorate Brian, Scott, Ariel, and Jennifer. This is one of the most devastating cave accidents in modern U.S. history. What makes it even more troubling is that we have even less information than normal when it comes to explaining what happened. Unsurprisingly, the Utah County coroner ruled all deaths as accidental drownings. But why did they drown? As I mentioned earlier, the pool at the bottom of Gollum's Cave is roughly 6 feet deep. This sounds virtually harmless until you take into account that this is also roughly the height of the chamber the water sits in. Depending on the water level, there might be only a little bit of headroom just below the cave ceiling, or there might be none at all. On the other side of the pool is another opening, which is really just a small room that can fit about 6 to 8 people maximum. There is also supposedly a rope inside the pool to help visitors travel across the pool. You might have to cross the pool underwater, but with the help of a guide rope and a distance of only 15 feet or so, this doesn't seem like something that could easily kill 4 young, healthy people, especially considering that the autopsy found no drugs or alcohol in any of their systems. And that's before you take into account the bizarre formation in which the group was apparently found. Not only did they all drown, but they were all found floating at the far end of the pool, facing the entrance. That is, as far as I can work out, the least likely formation for them to be in. And it's not like there was a current that could have pushed them all the way back there. They had to have died that way, and neither I nor anyone else I've been able to find have had any explanation for that. What is striking about this story is that, based on the context, most people probably don't wonder what happened. After all, it was a remote location nicknamed the Cave of Death. 4 people climbed down into it in the middle of the night and drowned at the bottom. Where's the mystery in that? Except it's actually very mysterious when you start looking at the specific details. Sadly, we'll never know the answers because the only people who were down in the cave when the tragedy took place were the victims themselves. If nothing else, the tragic tale of Gollum's Cave highlights the fact that cave exploration can be wildly unpredictable. To 4 young people in relatively good physical condition, a 90-foot descent, a shallow swim of 20 feet, and a small underground chamber sounded like navigable conditions. But due to some form of bad luck or another, something happened that the group wasn't expecting, and they paid the highest price for it. What do you think happened? Post your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like the video and subscribe for more caving stories in the near future. That's all for now. I'll see you next time.